The conference room on the 42nd floor had always smelled like expensive leather and ambition. Daniel Thomas sat at the mahogany table where he'd negotiated hundreds of deals, built partnerships across 3 continents, and transformed a struggling tech startup into a pre-IPO powerhouse worth $420 million. His coffee had gone cold in its cup, a thin film forming on the surface like ice on a winter pond. Across from him, Richard Calloway, the CEO he'd helped build from nothing, wouldn't meet his eyes. The morning had started normally enough. Daniel had arrived at 7:30, as he had for 19 years, stopping by the break room to chat with Miguel, the night security guard, about his grandson's basketball games. Miguel's grandson had scored 18 points in the regional semifinals, and Miguel's pride had been infectious. The kind of pure joy that reminded Daniel why he loved working in a building full of people rather than from some remote executive perch. He'd reviewed the quarterly reports over his first cup of coffee, approved 3 major client proposals that his team had worked on for months, and spent 45 minutes mentoring a young analyst named Rebecca who reminded him of himself 2 decades ago. Hungry, idealistic, believing that hard work and loyalty would be rewarded with security and respect. Then the email had arrived at 8:45. Daniel, please come to conference room A at 9 a.m. Richard. No context, no agenda, no warning. Just a time and a place, the kind of terse communication that Daniel had learned to recognize as bad news. But Daniel had felt it in his gut immediately, that sickening drop of intuition that precedes disaster, the way you know something's wrong before your conscious mind can articulate why. Now, sitting in the leather chair he'd helped select when they'd moved into this building 7 years ago, he remembered the debate about ergonomics versus aesthetics, remembered Richard insisting on Italian leather because perception matters to investors. Daniel watched Richard shuffle papers that didn't need shuffling. The HR director, Monica Reeves, sat rigidly beside Richard, her usual warmth replaced by corporate distance. Monica was a woman Daniel had personally recruited from Google 3 years ago, wooing her away with promises of equity and culture and the chance to build something meaningful rather than managing headcount for a faceless corporation. They'd had lunch together just last week, discussing her struggles with work-life balance. Daniel sharing advice from his own decades of experience about setting boundaries and protecting what mattered. Now she was the instrument of his dismissal, and the betrayal of that stung almost as much as Richard's. A company lawyer Daniel didn't recognize occupied the corner of the room, his laptop open, fingers poised over keys like a court stenographer waiting for testimony. The lawyer was young, maybe 30, wearing an expensive suit that suggested he came from one of the big firms downtown. His presence was a tell. This wasn't a conversation. It was a legal proceeding, carefully staged to protect the company from liability. 19 years, Daniel said quietly, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. He could feel his heart beating too fast, the way it had during his first investor pitch, during his daughter's birth, during the moments that divided life into before and after. I was employee number 7, Richard. I mortgaged my house to loan you seed money when no investor would touch you. Do you remember that? Jennifer and I had a 6-month-old baby. Emma was sleeping in a crib in our bedroom because we couldn't afford a bigger house, and I put our home on the line because I believed in your vision. Richard finally looked up, his jaw tight, a muscle twitching near his left eye. Daniel had seen that twitch before, during the acquisition attempt by their biggest competitor 5 years ago, during the scandal when a former executive had leaked trade secrets to TechCrunch, during every crisis they'd weathered together. But now the twitch meant something different. Now it meant guilt, awareness of betrayal, the physical manifestation of cognitive dissonance between what Richard knew was right and what he was about to do anyway. Business evolves, Daniel, Richard said, the words clearly rehearsed, probably scripted by corporate counsel or some expensive consultant who specialized in organizational transitions. We need fresh perspectives for the next phase. My son Blake just completed his MBA at Wharton. He understands the modern market in ways that... Richard paused, searching for diplomatic language that didn't exist, trying to find words that would make nepotism sound like strategy. In ways that align better with our growth trajectory. In ways that I don't? Daniel's laugh was hollow, echoing slightly in the acoustically engineered room that had been designed to make voices sound authoritative and important. I built your modern market, Richard. Every major client relationship, every strategic pivot, every crisis we survived, I was there. I was there when we nearly folded in year 3 because the Morrison account fell through and we couldn't make payroll. I was there when the server crash almost destroyed us and I spent 72 hours straight rebuilding our infrastructure from backup tapes. I was there when you had panic attacks before board meetings and I talked you down in the parking garage, reminding you of why we started this company. He could see Richard flinch at that last detail, a private moment now weaponized, the kind of vulnerability that men shared in crisis and later regretted revealing. But Daniel wasn't trying to be cruel. He was trying to make Richard remember who they'd been before the wealth, before the prestige, before a son with an Ivy League MBA had made a founding executive seem expendable. Blake was in high school when I was building the partnerships that made this IPO possible. Daniel continued, his voice gaining strength, fed by 19 years of accumulated knowledge and contribution. He was pledging fraternities when I was in Seoul at 3 in the morning, negotiating the contract that saved us from bankruptcy. He was spring breaking in Cancun when I missed my daughter's championship soccer game to fix the catastrophic code failure that could have destroyed client trust. He was networking at yacht clubs while I was actually building the network that this company runs on. Monica, the HR director, slid a severance packet across the table. Her hands shook slightly, a tremor that suggested she understood the moral weight of what was happening, that some part of her recognized this as wrong even as she participated in its execution. They'd had lunch together just last week, discussing her challenges with work-life balance, Daniel sharing advice from his own decades of experience. Now she was the instrument of his dismissal, reduced to a functionary in someone else's agenda. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Mr. Thomas, she said, her voice professionally neutral but strained, like someone reading a script they didn't write and didn't believe. The company is offering a generous package. 6 months salary, extended healthcare through the end of the calendar year, and continuation of your gym membership and parking privileges. We're also providing outplacement services through a top-tier firm, career counseling, and... Stop! Daniel held up his hand, the gesture gentle but absolute. He opened the packet slowly, his fingers, scarred on the right thumb from a carpentry accident during the early office build-out, when they'd all pitched in to renovate the space above the Vietnamese restaurant because they couldn't afford contractors. Carefully turning each page, he scanned the legal language with the precision that had made him legendary in contract negotiations, the attention to detail that had caught errors in billion-dollar deals, that had saved the company millions in avoided litigation over the years. His eyes caught on a clause, then moved to another document clipped behind it. Then another. The severance agreement, the non-compete, the non-disclosure, the liability waiver. Standard corporate divorce papers, designed to sever him cleanly from the organism he'd helped birth and nurture, to excise him like a tumor while minimizing damage to the host. But something cold settled in his stomach. Not despair, but recognition. The kind of recognition a chess player feels seeing the board 3 moves before checkmate, understanding that what looks like defeat might actually be the setup for something else entirely. You're offering me 6 months for 19 years, Daniel said slowly, his voice dropping to the tone he used in truly serious negotiations, the quiet register that made people lean forward to listen. And you want me to sign a non-compete that would essentially end my career in this industry. I see here that I'm barred from working for any company in enterprise software, cloud services, or business analytics, which is to say, everything I know how to do, for a period of 3 years within North America and Europe. That's not a non-compete. That's exile. Standard procedure for executive transitions, Richard said, his tone rehearsed, probably lifted verbatim from the corporate governance handbook Monica kept on her desk, highlighted and annotated. The board agreed that protecting our intellectual property and client relationships requires reasonable restrictions on. The board that I helped you select? Daniel interrupted, closing the folder carefully, his mind racing through a different set of documents entirely. Documents stored in a safety deposit box in a bank downtown. Documents that Richard had signed in a moment of desperation that neither of them had ever expected to matter. The board that includes Martin Chen, who I brought in from Singapore after 3 years of cultivation, and Patricia Okonkwo, who wouldn't have joined if I hadn't personally flown to Lagos to convince her during her mother's funeral. Sitting beside her through a grief that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings but everything to do with understanding that business is built on human relationships. Richard's face tightened. He glanced at Monica, then at the lawyer, as if looking for rescue from the quicksand he was sinking into. None came. The lawyer simply watched, his fingers still poised over his keyboard, waiting to document whatever came next for the inevitable litigation he was clearly anticipating. And Jeremy Walsh, Daniel continued, his voice gaining momentum, cataloging the relationships he'd built while Richard had played CEO, who was on the verge of bankruptcy when I connected him with the venture capital that saved his first company and earned his loyalty forever. And Sarah Mendez, who I mentored through her first board position and who told me just last month that I was the reason she believed women could succeed in tech leadership. And David Zhao and Jennifer Kim, and every other board member who actually knows how this company functions beyond the PowerPoint presentations. Daniel, Richard began, but Daniel wasn't finished. This board that agreed on my termination. Did you tell them you were replacing me with your unqualified son? Or did you frame it as fresh leadership and generational transition and all the other euphemisms that hide nepotism behind consulting speak? Did you mention that Blake has never built anything? Never led a team through crisis? Never sat across from a client who was betting their business on our platform and had to look them in the eye and promise we'd deliver? Richard stood abruptly, buttons on his custom Tom Ford suit, catching the morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Beyond the glass, the city spread out like a circuit board, millions of people pursuing their own ambitions, fighting their own battles, unaware of the small human drama playing out 42 floors above the street. Cars moved along streets like blood cells through arteries, and Daniel had a momentary vertigo, a sense of how small this all was in the grand scheme, how much emotional weight he'd invested in something that from a distance looked insignificant. This isn't personal, Daniel, Richard said, his voice hardening into the CEO tone he used for earnings calls and investor presentations, the voice that brooked no disagreement because it claimed to speak for markets and boards and forces larger than individual sentiment. It's strategic restructuring. Blake brings new energy, new networks, new vision. The IPO is in 8 weeks. We need family continuity for investor confidence. Studies show that family-led companies outperform in market capitalization and stop quoting the McKinsey report you clearly just read, Daniel said, his patience finally cracking like ice over deep water. I've been in this industry long enough to know the difference between data and rationalization. You want to hand your son a company he didn't build because you're afraid of your own mortality. You want legacy more than you want success. And you're willing to betray 19 years of partnership to get it. The room fell silent except for the soft hum of the ventilation system and the distant sound of traffic far below. Monica was staring at her hands, no longer even pretending to participate in the meeting. The lawyer had stopped typing, recognizing that whatever was happening had moved beyond the script he'd been prepared for. Richard's face had gone red, then white, cycling through the colors of anger and shame like a biological mood ring. Daniel remained seated, his fingers drumming once against the table, a habit from his earliest days at the company when they'd worked in a cramped office above a Vietnamese restaurant, surviving on instant noodles and desperation, believing that if they just worked hard enough, if they just stayed honest enough, success would follow naturally. How naive that seemed now, he thought. How beautiful that naivety had been, when they'd believed that building something good would naturally lead to good outcomes, that merit mattered more than connections, that loyalty would be reciprocated rather than exploited. Tell me, Richard, Daniel said softly, the danger in his voice unmistakable to anyone who'd ever negotiated against him, who'd seen him dismantle opposition with quiet precision rather than loud aggression. Does Blake know about the titanium clause? The color drained from Richard's face so quickly that, for a moment, Daniel worried he might actually faint. Monica looked confused, glancing between them with widening eyes. Even the lawyer in the corner straightened slightly, his attention sharpening, fingers moving to his laptop as if to search some database he'd missed during his due diligence. That's... Richard's voice came out strangled. He cleared his throat, tried again, his hand moving unconsciously to his tie as if it had suddenly become too tight. That's buried deep in the founding documents. It's not relevant to current. Oh, but it is, Daniel interrupted, standing now, buttoning his jacket with the deliberate calm of someone who'd just drawn a royal flush after being dealt what everyone assumed was a losing hand. The titanium clause that I wrote and you signed in year 2, when we nearly went bankrupt after the Morrison account fell through and I personally guaranteed our office lease because the landlord was going to evict us. Remember that, Richard? Remember sitting in that Vietnamese restaurant downstairs at 2 in the morning, eating cold pho because it was all we could afford, while I drafted protective language on a legal pad because we couldn't afford actual lawyers? He could see the memory flickering across Richard's face. Younger men, hungrier men, men who'd believed they were building something different from the corporate machines they'd escaped. They'd been 34 and 35 years old, both recently divorced from their first marriages, both carrying debt from failed ventures, both desperate for this one last shot at success before middle age closed its doors on their dreams. They'd made promises to each other at 2 in the morning over cold soup, promises about how they'd never become the kind of leaders who forgot where they came from, who forgot the people who built them. The clause that states, Daniel continued, his voice taking on the formal tone of legal recitation, if any founding executive with continuous service exceeding 15 years is terminated without documented cause of fraud, embezzlement, or gross negligence, said executive retains the right to trigger a mandatory audit of all financial statements, partnership agreements, and executive compensations by an independent third party before any major liquidity event. The lawyer was typing frantically now, pulling up documents on his screen, his face growing pale as he apparently found what Daniel was referencing. Monica had gone completely still, her breath shallow, one hand pressed to her mouth as if physically holding back words she wanted to say but couldn't. The morning light through the windows seemed harsher suddenly, throwing everything into sharp relief, making the expensive furniture look temporary and fragile. You wouldn't? Richard said finally, but his voice lacked conviction, the words more prayer than statement. An IPO, Richard, is certainly a major liquidity event, Daniel said, picking up his briefcase, the same leather case Jennifer had given him on his first day 19 years ago, now worn at the corners and scarred by countless trips through airport security, but still functional, still reliable, unlike some partnerships he could name. And you've just terminated me without cause. Performance reviews for 19 consecutive years rated exceptional or outstanding. Not a single disciplinary action. Not one written warning. No documented negligence. No client complaints. No ethical violations. He pulled out his phone, scrolled to a folder he'd hoped never to open, and showed Richard the screen. Dozens of performance reviews, scanned and stored in the cloud, awards and commendations, client testimonials, board meeting minutes where his contributions were praised effusively. He'd been thorough, methodical, documenting everything not out of paranoia but out of the careful habit of someone who'd learned early that documentation mattered, that memory was unreliable, that the only defense against revisionist history was contemporaneous records. I kept everything, Richard, Daniel said, his voice soft but implacable. Because I'm thorough. Because I learned early that documentation matters. And because, somewhere deep down, I think I always knew this moment might come. Maybe not from you specifically, but from someone. Because this is what happens when companies grow large enough that gratitude becomes inconvenient, when loyalty becomes a liability on the balance sheet, when the people who built you become reminders of promises you want to forget. The lawyer was frantically typing on his laptop now, pulling up what must have been the founding documents, his face growing paler with each paragraph he read. The HR director had gone completely pale, one hand pressed to her mouth as if physically holding back words, and Daniel could see tears forming at the corners of her eyes. Whether from guilt or fear or simple human sympathy, he couldn't tell. Daniel, be reasonable, Richard said, his composure cracking like ice over deep water, fissures spreading across the surface of his CEO persona. His hands were shaking now, trembling enough that he had to clasp them together to hide the movement, and the CEO mask was slipping to reveal the frightened man beneath. If you trigger that clause, the audit will delay the IPO by months, maybe kill it entirely. Market conditions are perfect right now, but they won't stay that way. The Fed is talking about rate hikes. Competition is intensifying. The window is closing. You'll be destroying value for everyone. employees with stock options who are counting on this payout to send their kids to college, early investors who believed in us when we were nothing, partners who have invested resources in anticipation of our public offering. Partners who believed in us. Daniel echoed, his voice heavy with irony so thick it was almost physical. Not partners who believed in nepotism and age discrimination dressed up as strategic restructuring. Not partners who thought that family succession was more important than competence or merit or 19 years of building relationships and delivering results. He walked toward the door, each step measured, the motion of someone who'd made an irrevocable decision and felt the strange peace that comes from crossing a line you can never uncross. At the threshold, he paused, his hand on the brushed steel handle, cool against his palm. I gave you 19 years of my life, Richard, Daniel said, his voice carrying the weight of nearly 2 decades of accumulated sacrifice. I missed my daughter's piano recitals for your emergency meetings, and there were dozens, weren't there? Late-night emergencies that turned out to be your anxiety attacks, your need for reassurance, your inability to make decisions without someone to validate them. I skipped anniversaries for your crisis management. I was there at 3 in the morning when you called panicking about board presentations. I coached you through every major negotiation because you froze under pressure. I built this company like it was my own child because you promised, Richard, that we were building something that mattered, something beyond quarterly returns and founder exits. Richard had sunk back into his chair, his face in his hands, and for a moment Daniel saw not the CEO but the scared man he'd met 19 years ago, the person who'd needed Daniel's strength and competence and loyalty to become something larger than himself. Monica was openly crying now, tears streaming down her face as she maintained her corporate composure by sheer force of will, tissue pressed to her eyes, and the lawyer had the decency to look uncomfortable, as if he'd signed up for a standard termination and found himself witnessing something far more human and painful. You'll have nothing, Richard said desperately, looking up with red-rimmed eyes that betrayed the terror beneath his executive facade. The non-compete still stands. You'll be blacklisted. No one in tech will touch you after you sabotage a major IPO. I have friends at every major firm, Daniel. I'll make sure everyone knows you're vindictive, unreliable, a liability. You'll spend the rest of your career in obscurity. And for what? Wounded pride? The satisfaction of dragging everyone down with you? Daniel turned back, and for the first time that morning, he smiled. Not with bitterness or anger, but with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent 2 decades reading fine print and understanding that the most important victories aren't measured in stock prices or job titles, or the respect of an industry that had forgotten its own values. The non-compete is void if triggered by unlawful termination, Richard, Daniel said, his voice almost gentle now, as if explaining something obvious to a child. Age discrimination is quite unlawful, as is constructive discharge when you create impossible conditions designed to force resignation. I know this because I actually read the employment law handbook that our corporate counsel prepared, the handbook that, ironically, I requested we create to protect our employees from exactly this kind of treatment. He shifted the briefcase to his other hand, a gesture so familiar after 19 years that it felt like breathing, like blinking, like all the unconscious movements that constitute a life. But more importantly, Daniel continued, his voice softening further, I don't need another job in tech. I've saved carefully. My house is paid off, the one I mortgaged for your seed money, remember? The one Jennifer and I cried over when we signed those loan papers because we were betting our family's security on your dream. Jennifer's pottery business is successful now, bringing in enough income that my potential unemployment is merely inconvenient rather than catastrophic. Emma is on a full scholarship to university, studying business ethics of all things. My son Marcus has a good job in environmental engineering. I'm 53 years old, Richard. Old enough to understand that some things matter more than career trajectory. Old enough to know that I can look at myself in the mirror, or I can have industry respect, but I probably can't have both if the industry values what you're doing here today. He paused, letting the words settle into the room like sediment sinking through water. I need to sleep at night, Daniel said simply. I need to look at myself in the mirror without flinching. I need to show my children that principles aren't just abstract concepts you teach them and then abandon when they become inconvenient. I need to demonstrate that 19 years of building something meaningful cannot be erased by your ego and your son's entitlement and your fear of aging without leaving a dynasty. The lawyer had closed his laptop, recognizing a lost cause when he saw one, understanding that whatever happened next was beyond his ability to control or document. Monica was no longer even pretending to maintain composure, her professional mask completely shattered, and Daniel felt a pang of sympathy for her. She was just trying to keep her job, just trying to execute orders from above, caught in the machinery of something larger and uglier than her individual choices. My lawyer will file the titanium clause activation on Monday morning at 9 a.m. sharp, Daniel said, his voice now completely calm, almost conversational, as if discussing the weather or weekend plans. That gives you 72 hours to reconsider your strategic restructuring. You can call an emergency board meeting. You can explain the situation. You can reverse this decision, offer me a proper role with proper respect, and acknowledge that experience and loyalty have value in a world increasingly designed to discard both. He opened the door, the hallway beyond stretching like a bridge to an uncertain future, fluorescent lights harsh after the softer ambience of the conference room. Otherwise, Daniel said, delivering his final words without looking back, his voice echoing slightly in the corridor, every investor, every partner, every financial institution involved in your IPO will receive notice of the mandatory audit. They'll see every sweetheart deal, every questionable expense, every corner you cut while I was busy actually building the business. And Richard, I've been the chief operating officer for 12 years. I know where every body is buried, every offshore account that's technically legal but ethically questionable, every client relationship that's held together by handshake agreements that would evaporate under scrutiny, every projection that's optimistic to the point of fantasy. Richard's face had gone gray, the color of old snow, and Daniel could see him doing the mental calculation, tallying up all the decisions that had seemed defensible in isolation but would look damning under the harsh light of audit. The audit will be thorough, Daniel continued, 1 foot already in the hallway, halfway between the world he was leaving and whatever came next. Independent, public, everything that investors deserve to see before they hand you $420 million based on projections that have more hope than basis in reality. Maybe the company survives it. Maybe it even thrives with real transparency, with honest accounting, with leadership that values substance over appearance. But your reputation, Richard? Your comfortable exit? Blake's inheritance of a company he didn't earn? Those things will die in the light. The door closed softly behind him, but the sound echoed like thunder in the conference room he'd never see again. And Daniel Thomas walked away from 19 years of his life with nothing but a briefcase and the knowledge that some prices are worth paying. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.